Tanshi Kiewa, hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands on CFCR 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory. Andrea Letting Dishney my name is Andrea Letting, call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host today over this next hour. I'm part settler, fully ally, and a relation to all. I come from primarily Irish and Scandinavian heritage with a little bit of mystery, and that's the way I was raised, with a special fondness for my Indigenous relations because they are the hosts who have welcomed all the guests. I was especially close to my Métis relations from Batoche, and I've always tried to live that mio pivotis when that beautiful good life. Today we welcome our special guest from the Navajo Nation. Jake Skeets is the author of two books of poetry, Eyes Bottle Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers. I love that title. And winner of the National Poetry Series, American Book Award, Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and Whiting Award. And the highly anticipated second collection, Horses. His work has appeared in journals and magazines such as Poetry, the New York Times Magazine, and the Paris Review. Other honors include an NEA Grant for Arts Projects, a Mellon Projecting All Voices Fellowship, and the 2023 to 2024 Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. He is the third Navajo Nation Poet Laureate and teaches at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome, Jake. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I would love to hear about both your collections and a little bit more about how long you've been writing poetry, what it means to you, just everything. I'd love to hear everything. So wherever you want to start.
Yeah, no, sure. I can definitely start sort of at the start, perhaps. I have been writing poetry seriously. I sort of I did my undergraduate degree in creative writing with a focus in poetry. But before that, I feel like poetry was beginning to show up in a lot of my interests, sort of in high school, maybe even earlier than that. Right now, I'm kind of like on a kind of journey trying to investigate where poetry sort of showed up. Um, but I have like past assignments from elementary school where writing was kind of like the assignment. So I feel like it's definitely been a part of my curriculum for the in some part. But of course, I got serious about poetry sort of around undergrad and of course going into graduate school, which of course led me to my first book, Eyes Bottle Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers. The book itself was my thesis manuscript. So I graduated from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and I was very fortunate to sort of study under some incredible indigenous poets, Sir Sherwin Bitsui, Joan Naviute Kane, and Santi Frazier, really sort of in the legacy of writers and poets who have gone through the Institute of American Indian Arts. And it's been quite a journey since then, which led me to my second collection, Horses. I sort of began writing it very slowly, maybe around 2020, 2021. But it took me about, another year or so to sort of finish and finalize it. I feel like I'm hoping Horses feels like a very soft departure from Eyes Bottle Dark. Of course, the themes of landscape and masculinity, and the kind of entanglement between the two are still very much prevalent in Horses. But I'm hoping that this second book does feel like a kind of evolution or kind of growth, as my work, or as a writer and as a poet. Um, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a great overview. It's poetry is I mean it's amazing. It's amazing that the Santa Fe Institute, I've heard so many good things about it. I know people that have studied there. It's a great kind of place for like leading Indigenous artistry, poetry, teaching. Um, Tell me more about both collections. Like you kind of talked a little bit about them, but and obviously, like your first collection was your thesis. Um, but what when you talk about like the departure and what kind of nuances that were there? What kind of what was your process?
Hmm. Well, the first book is really focused around my hometown of Gallup, New Mexico. It's a border town, so it borders the Navajo Nation. I actually grew up in an area just south of Gallup on the Navajo Nation, but I'm sort of situated in an area called, that's called like a checkerboarded area, right? Going back to the Dawes Act, where in an attempt to assimilate native nations, they sort of created these plots of, these acres of land and attempted to give it to native folks. And so I grew up in an area that was kind of very divided. So, a mile north of me was non-reservation land, as is, land south of me. So, Eyes Bottle Dark is really kind of an interrogation of what it meant to travel into Gallup as, as a child because I was, bussed into the public school system in Gallup. Um, and sort of just growing up in a border town, what does it mean to sort of witness the kind of racism and violence that Native people endure in those kind of places? I think border zones across the world, right, are always full of different types of violences. But it's also there's a tremendous beauty in Gallup. The landscape is one of my favorite types of landscape. It's red earth, it's sandstone cliff sides, very big blue sky. And of course, a lot of Diné families have such cherished memories around the town of Gallup. It's not only this really interesting place of violence, it's this interesting place that we all continue to cherish. We all have stories about traveling into Gallup on the weekends with our families. And so it's a very complicated place. It's a very nuanced place. And so Ice Bottle Dark is kind of of this sort of engagement with that town. And on the cover of Eyes Bottle Dark is a Richard Avedon portrait that was taken in 1979 when Avedon was touring the Western states for his book called In the American West. And he was taking portraits of people with what he considered odd jobs. So he took portraits of beekeepers and folks who worked at the carnival or circus, grave diggers, and those types of occupations. And so he traveled through Gallup in 1979 and took a picture of my uncle, actually. Um, and he labeled my uncle's occupation as drifter, which I thought was interesting, because my uncle was not a drifter. So it's a very sort of specific kind of framing and orientation. And of course, if you know anything about Richard Avedon and the way that he plays with light, there's also this kind of absence of background and absence of meaning and context. So my uncle's figure is sort of on this white space, almost like the way a poem sort of operates visually on the page. But so the portrait was taken in 1979. Unfortunately, my uncle Benson was murdered in Gallup a year later in 1980. Of course, my family had no idea that my uncle agreed to take this photograph. So in 1985, when Richard Avedon finished the book, he sent a signed copy to my family, of course, having no idea that, this even occurred or happened. And they had this photograph of someone they had lost, 5 years before. And so my book sort of became then a conversation or a response to that particular portrait, and it's now on the cover of Eyes Bottle Dark. And with horses, um, actually quite similarly, it began with the photograph. As I was trying to figure out what my second book might become or what it could be, I was doing, just very light research, looking through archives and articles from tribal newspapers where I'm from. And I came across this news article of nearly 200 horses found dead on the Navajo Nation, who they got stuck in this dried stock pond. And if you're familiar with the Western states, These stock ponds are places where, water is provided for wildlife populations, so specifically wild horses. And so, these horses got stuck, and unfortunately perished. And so the Navajo Nation just ended up having to um, bury the horses on site because it was there was no mechanisms available to transport the bodies of these animals. And the portraits that were sort of on news articles, or just as striking as seeing the portrait of my uncle. And so it very much became again, the book became a conversation of this photograph, unraveling from there to sort of deal with the Navajo Nation as a whole and the ways in which climate change is sort of this physical manifestation, right? That we can physically see climate change. It's not this conceptual thing. It's not this future event that could happen. It's an ongoing, and it has been an ongoing crisis. And so I'm really interested in how then these poems are engaging with this photograph and this reality. And when I said soft departure, I'm thinking that perhaps horses is more so a kind of expansive view of the Navajo Nation and maybe even the country of the United States, or at least these Western states in this Western frontier, as opposed to focusing on a single city.
Beautiful kind of comparison of the two books, two manuscripts, and it's so fascinating that they both kind of come from a similar point of photograph, but that it can kind of inspire a whole kind of manuscript and collection and worldview, and that's an amazing story about your uncle, about that photograph being taken, and they didn't even know. Wow. Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Um, yeah. So tell me more about like how you work. What is there is do you kind of have like a ritual or a practice, or do you like get up at 5 every morning, or do you wait for inspiration, or what's your approach to your work?
Mm, that's a good question. And I've also been thinking about my process as well, or at least trying to characterize it. I think I can maybe divide my process into two parts. And hopefully that this is not sort of read as, oh, this is absolution. I think it's more so just a general trying to characterize how I write. And of course, there are definitely nuances and changes, of course, on the daily because, um, I tend to be a writer who doesn't necessarily write every day, um, or has an organized schedule at all. But I think the first part of my writing process is very much inspiration and sort of searching for particular kinds of inspiration. And what that entails is really just living my life, basically, in the simplest terms. Making sure that I'm going to my job as a professor, making sure I have spending time with friends and family, all the while paying attention to things happening around me and making sure I'm listening to different cues that the universe might be sending my way, for instance, right? And I sort of then collect all these different things that I gather from living my life. Um, and I collect them in a lot of different ways. I mean, I have a phone with my notes app where I have these different phrasings or words or images that sort of pop up on my day-to-day life. And then I've been also trying to write more, so I have an actual notebook now that I can actually pull out and write down these little what Pam Houston calls glimmers, right? These kind of things that happen to me or things that I hear or things that pop in my head. Um, and then when it comes time to write, when I have time, right, when I have a dedicated time to actually sit down in front of a computer or blank sheet of paper, um, I then begin to sort of create a kind of laboratory in my head and in my small space of language where I'm beginning to play around with these different images and lines and pieces of language to sort of piece through a poem. Um, and I feel like that really summarizes the first part of the process. I think the second part of the process, when I have then these poems that are beginning to have conversations with each other, right? I began a whole new process of gathering where I'm looking for different threads, different things that are beginning to sort of speak to me. All the while now going to the archives for sure, like looking at photographs, looking at things and investigating these questions that might be coming up in what I've been gathering. And generally in this process is I'll find a kind of like trigger for the manuscript. And when that happens, the second part then becomes very intensive, where I'm now drafting not just poems, I'm now looking at a book, right? I'm now compiling a book and working toward one. And that can, be very intense. I have times when I can definitely sort of just zone everybody out and sort of focus in. And it's not just all research, it's definitely still drafting. It's all experimental and mostly play. The concentration that's involved with my poetry in this stage is very much experiment and taking as much risk as possible on the page.
I love hearing about people's processes as artists. You know, there's sometimes common threads, but there's so much depends on the individual style, right? What works for you and kind of how. But I love, hearing how things come together. Was the style the same for both your manuscripts, like that process, or were you kind of still working on it, or?
Yeah, no, it was the same process for both. I think the difference between the two manuscripts is that um with Eyes Bottled Dark, my first book, again, that was my thesis. So I had the gift of peers and mentors who were able to explore these threads with me and really sort of help highlight and illustrate things that I might be missing. So having, another pair of eyes, another life story, another way of thinking about the work was super helpful. And I think that only added to the kind of layering that occurs in the first book. In the second book, Horses, I made it a kind of rule or a constraint that I placed on myself to have no one read the manuscript. I wanted to prove to myself that I'm a writer, that I'm a poet, that I'm a poet that doesn't, solely um, exist in workshop or in community or, in workshop. And so my community and my peers and my mentors became other books. And so I studied other poets, looked at poetry collections that I admired and tried to figure out what was happening on the page, um, and wrote this collection entirely on my own. It wasn't until I got, a large portion of the book finished and began sort of, uh, shopping it around for potential publishers that I shared it with, my agents and some other mentors that I have. But yeah, for the most part, at least up until recently, right, no one else had seen the book. But of course, now it's in the hands of people, and early reviewers and book reviewers are beginning to see it, and soon the whole public will have it. And so I'm really excited to for that part to have conversations like this with folks who are now beginning to read the book, because for so long it's been something I cherished, and really held secret for quite some time.
That's a fascinating difference between the two, where one is kind of like, I know I've been in workshops and it's very collaborative, right? Like, and you'll get suggestions or, why don't you try this? Or, it's very kind of, it almost feels like yeah, there's lots of influence. And I love that you went to other books instead. That became your review. Do you have any are there any particular collections that come to mind or any particular poets that influenced you that you wanted to mention or not really?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, in the back of the book, I have a kind of long acknowledgments or kind of these essays where I talk about what influenced the book, because I really wanted to honor that community, right? Of people who weren't physically there with me, but through their words and their art were guiding me in some way. And specifically, of course, like I have to mention the books by Lucy Tapahanso, Blue Horses. Russian is the book by Lucy Tapahanso, who's another Diné poet. There's another book called Blue Horses for Navajo Women by Nia Francisco. which is, considered one of the earliest, poetry collections by a Diné poet. And then I have to mention, of course, Joy Harjo's She Had Some Horses, right? I can't I don't exist without that book, right? As a poet, it's a collection I turn to always. And so that was a collection I definitely sort of moved through and tried to interrogate it as much as I can. And I definitely drew a lot of inspiration from the album Horses by Patti Smith. Um, I know Patti Smith is also a poet and writer, as well as a musician and artist. So I really wanted to think outside my own medium. And so I have poems that are responding to, native filmmakers, right? And having these larger conversations with people who work outside poetry. And yeah, so I was trying to create community in a way that felt perhaps intellectual or conceptual, right? As opposed to, just having being pretty physically.
I love all those poets, and especially Joe Harjo is legendary. I noticed on your website you had a one of your first blurbs was actually a beautiful comment from her. So yeah, that's amazing, amazing. And of course is she still Poet Laureate of the United States, or is she past Poet Laureate?
No, no. No, yeah, no longer, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so but still legendary. That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many great poets, and a lot of there's a lot of Dene poets, hey, that and do you want to speak about that? Is there something about the Dene culture or language or what do you have any theories?
I think yes. I mean, there's a running joke around here that, all Diné writers are poets. Diné fiction and Diné prose itself are so rare that, a lot of our writers are indeed poets. And I do think it has to deal with language, right? And the ways in which we tell stories. And of course, this could be true for all indigenous cultures. So I can't, but of course, I can't speak to those. I can only speak to the Navajo Nation. And I know in exploring the Nepazar or the Diné language that it's a language that is very poetic. It's highly charged by its verbs, right? And it's a language that requires effort and labor. Like, there's not an easy way to say things. There's no colloquialisms that can happen in Diné. You have to, when you're speaking in Diné, you have to address the time, the people in the room with you, what is exactly happening in terms of positionality. So you're illuminating the world around the words you're using before you get to people. And then you get, of course, and all of that is really charged by what people are doing or what things are happening, right? And poetry, of course, is a language that's also charged by verbs, right? Verbs are sort of or what make or is what making those images really come alive on the page. So yeah, I think definitely my theory is that, and this of course is a theory shared across many Diné poets, is that our language, even if say a Diné person doesn't really speak Diné, they're still hearing remnants of it in the ways in which their family talks, even if it's English, right? But it's of course they're talking in what might be considered a broken English or an English that has a particular accent. But for me, I'm thinking that's just a marriage between Diné and English, right? And so it's nothing broken about that. It's just a braiding of influence. And so when I know that when I'm home listening to the way my parents tell stories or the way my aunts or uncles tell stories, that's poetry. And when you are growing up with it, it makes sense that then you decide to write a poem that you tell a story in a similar way, that you're illuminating the world and you're making it alive with the verbs you decide to use. So yes, of course, I think our language, for the most part, is one of the creative engines of why there's so many Diné poets.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. And the Cree language and the Michif language also, very descriptive and verb-based, like you say, like just and huge long words that are built of all these pieces, right? Then it's just so descriptive, right? And yeah, it's amazing. So I love kind of exploring that, it's
Mhm.
really cool facet of poetry. We have just like maybe like 2 more minutes before we go to the break here, but what else would you like to talk about? I know in the second half you maybe be sharing some of your poetry, but anything else that kind of comes to mind that you'd like to give some words to?
Sure. Yeah. No, and I say this at the end of the book as well, but when I was writing this book, as writing my first book too, yes, they're very grief heavy. They start with tragedy, of course. The second book, Horses, is dealing with a crisis that is ongoing around us, right? And more each day, we're beginning to see the ways in which climate change is becoming real and tactile and impacting us, our homes, our families. It's not something that we can run away from anymore or pretend it's no longer there. But as I was sort of meditating on this, I found that by focusing on memory and language and the power that might be within those elements, I began sort of seeing a possible way through. And so a lot of the book then became kind of a journey toward joy. Like, how do we feel joy? How do we celebrate each other? And people have come before us. Um, amidst everything that's happening, right? How do we feel joy during an apocalypse? And I feel like what's really great about Diné or just indigenous time is that it's very cyclical. That apocalypse has happened before, right? And as a people, we always grow stronger because of it. So yes, it's a book about grief and tragedy and crisis, but it's also a book about language and a book about memory and the celebration of memory and language. It's very much, in my view, a book that at least leans toward joy. Maybe not explicitly joyous, but it doesn't forget joy. It doesn't forget hope. And I'm really excited and eager that readers really understand that distinction. That even though we don't feel joy right now, we could potentially feel joy later. And I feel like that is some teaching in Diné. I just don't have a way to articulate it because I'm not a first, I don't speak Diné myself. And so, but one day I'll be able to articulate it, I'm sure.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that leaning towards joy. So we'll be right back after the break. So don't turn that dial. You're listening to Navajo poet Jake Skeets on 90.5 FM CFCR, and of course our YouTube channel as well. So if you're just tuning in, you can catch the whole episode there. We'll be right back after this break.